In the winter of 1475, the Ottoman Empire marched into a narrow valley, certain it would crush a small principality and open the road into Central Europe. But what waited for them was not fear, not surrender. It was a united people, steady, silent, and prepared for a deadly ambush. High on the frozen ridges, Stephen watched with an army half the size of the force approaching him. Every slope, every river crossing, every breath of fog had been shaped for this moment. And when the Ottomans stepped into the heart of the valley, the silence shattered. Arrows fell like rain. Cannons tore through the mist. The frozen river split beneath fleeing soldiers. And when the fog finally lifted, an empire lay broken. A small nation had held the gateway into Europe, and the echo of that morning would travel across the continent for centuries. In the 1400s, Europe was a place of shifting borders and constant fear. To the south, the Ottoman Empire was rising with terrifying speed. Its armies had captured Constantinople and were pushing deeper into the Balkans every year. To many Europeans, the Ottomans looked unstoppable, an empire that swallowed kingdoms the way storms swallow coastlines. North of this growing power lay a much smaller territory, Moldavia. It was a rural principality of forests, hills, and river valleys. Not rich, not heavily fortified, and not backed by a powerful alliance. What made Moldavia important was its location. It sat right between the Ottomans, the Kingdom of Hungary, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Whichever power controlled Moldavia would control the trade routes, the river crossings, and the roadways leading directly into Central Europe. That meant one thing. Moldavia had no room to make mistakes. The ruler of this small land was Stephen, later known as Stephen the Great. He had inherited a principality surrounded by stronger, wealthier neighbors. Moldavia could not compete with their cannons, their cavalry, or their massive treasuries. So Stephen ruled with caution. He negotiated carefully, paid tribute when necessary, and tried to avoid provoking any of the giants around him. But even caution had limits. Years of Ottoman expansion placed Moldavia under growing pressure. Taxes demanded by the empire increased. Political demands grew heavier. Control of key ports, especially Schilia and Cetatea Alba, became a constant struggle. Stephen watched as other small states tried to appease the Ottomans, only to lose more territory each year. He understood the pattern. Once an empire begins tightening its grip, it rarely loosens it. At first, Stephen tried to maintain peace, but soon the demands became too much. The Ottomans began treating Moldavia less as an ally and more as property, something to be absorbed into the empire when convenient. Stephen realized that if he continued to comply, Moldavia would slowly disappear. Tension rose along the border. Clashes broke out between Moldavian patrols and Ottoman forces. Disputes over fortresses turned into armed confrontations. Stephen opposed certain Ottoman policies, and Istanbul saw this not as disagreement, but as defiance. By late 1474, the relationship had collapsed completely. The Ottoman leadership decided Moldavia had become a problem, and problems needed to be crushed quickly before they encouraged others to resist. Commanders began assembling an army large enough to overwhelm Stephen in a single campaign. For Moldavia, this was not simply a political conflict. It was the beginning of a fight for survival. Stephen received warnings from his scouts. An Ottoman army, tens of thousands strong, was gathering to march north. He could not outnumber them. He could not outspend them. But he could prepare. And the decisions he made in the weeks before the invasion would lead them all toward a frozen valley near a town called Vaslui, a place where history would bend in a direction no empire expected. Winter arrived in Moldavia with a harsh, unforgiving silence. Snow covered the hills, the forests, and the frozen roads leading in from the south. Most armies avoided campaigning during this season, but Stephen of Moldavia didn't have that choice. He knew the Ottomans were gathering their forces, and every day of winter brought them closer. If Moldavia waited passively, it would be crushed before spring. Stephen began preparing long before the first enemy soldier crossed the border. His strategy depended not on size or wealth, because he had neither, but on turning Moldavia itself into an obstacle. Villagers living near the southern frontier were quietly moved to safer areas. Food stores were relocated so invading soldiers wouldn't find anything to feed themselves with. Paths through the woods were altered or blocked. Wells were covered. Frozen river crossings were mapped in detail because an army that didn't know where the ice was thin could suffer devastating losses before a single arrow was fired. The people did not complain or panic. Moldavians had lived with danger for generations, and they trusted Stephen completely. They knew this was the only way to make the land work for them instead of for the invaders. While the villages prepared, Stephen reorganized his army. He couldn't match the Ottomans man for man, so he focused on speed, mobility, and knowledge of the terrain. Light cavalry units were placed at the center of his strategy. Fast riders who could strike deeply, disappear into the trees, and reappear miles away. Archers practiced firing from horseback and from hidden positions behind ridges. His elite troops, the men he trusted most, remained close to him, ready to be used at the crucial moment. Even the peasant levies, men with little armor but fierce loyalty, were given roles that suited their strengths. They knew the forest better than any outsider, and that alone made them valuable fighters. By the time preparations were complete, Stephen had gathered roughly 20,000 men. It was smaller than the Ottoman army would be, but far more suited to Moldavia's winter landscape. He did not promise victory. Instead, he told his people that their survival depended on fighting like Moldavians, quick, adaptable, and impossible to pin down. Stephen also reached out to other Christian rulers, hoping for reinforcements. If Moldavia fell, the Ottomans would have a clear road toward Hungary and Poland. Yet when his envoys returned, they carried only polite words, not troops. Poland offered sympathy. Hungary offered intentions. Neither sent soldiers. Stephen accepted this reality. Waiting for help would only waste time he didn't have. As December passed, Moldavian scouts reported real movement along the Danube. Ottoman supply lines were forming. Camps were being built. The commander, Hatem Suleiman Pasha, was gathering tens of thousands of men for a march into Moldavia. Stephen's response was not to strike early or to provoke skirmishes. Instead, he disappeared from Ottoman sight. His camps were concealed in the forests. His cavalry avoided unnecessary fights. He gave the impression of fear, of retreat, so the Ottomans would advance with confidence, thinking Moldavia was already on its knees. Behind that illusion, he prepared the battlefield. Stephen focused on a valley near the town of Vaslui, a place shaped by marshes, fog, narrow slopes, and frozen riverbeds. He studied how the fog settled at dawn, how sound carried across the valley, and where the ground turned soft beneath the snow. It was a place where a larger army would struggle to maneuver. It was a place where Moldavians could strike hard from hidden heights and vanish before the enemy understood what had happened. He ordered trenches to be dug beneath layers of snow so they would be invisible to advancing troops. Archers were placed behind ridges where the Ottomans wouldn't see them until the first volley of arrows fell. Small cannons mounted on sleds were hidden in the woods so they could be moved quietly and fired without revealing their exact position. To increase Ottoman confidence even more, Moldavian riders attacked supply wagons or scouting parties only briefly before disappearing. These quick strikes created the illusion of chaos, of a country breaking apart, of an army too small and too frightened to stand and fight. None of it was accidental. Every move was part of a larger plan, and then came the news Stephen had been waiting for. The Ottoman army had crossed into Moldavia. Tens of thousands of soldiers were marching north, following the roads and valleys Stephen had already turned into a trap. As they advanced deeper into Moldavian territory, the winter fog thickened, the rivers froze unevenly, and the valley near Vaslui grew closer with every step. The Ottomans believed they were pursuing a desperate enemy. They believed victory was inevitable. But Stephen knew better. He knew that the empire was marching straight toward the place he had chosen, the place where numbers would matter far less than preparation. The trap was ready. All that remained was for the Ottomans to walk into it. Before dawn on January 10, 1475, the valley near Vaslui was swallowed in a thick, frozen fog. It rolled across the ground like smoke from an unseen fire, blurring the ridges, hiding the riverbanks, and turning the air into a cold, pale wall. Stephen had been waiting for this exact condition. He knew the Ottomans relied on visibility and tight formations. Fog would break that, silently, completely. The first sign of the Ottoman advance was not seen, but heard, the dull, distant rumble of boots, hooves, and wagons. Tens of thousands of men were pushing their way through a narrow valley, unaware of how the ground twisted beneath the snow. They believed the Moldavians were retreating further north. They believed the valley was empty. It wasn't. Stephen's troops were already in position, spread across the high ridges on both sides of the valley floor. They were silent, unmoving shapes half hidden behind trees, rocks, and snow-covered earthworks. Archers held their bows steady, waiting for the signal. Cavalry units crouched beside their horses in total stillness. No fires burned, no voices rose. It was as if the entire Moldavian army had become part of the frozen landscape. The Ottomans entered the valley in long columns, unaware that the fog was hiding thousands of eyes watching their every step. As they moved forward, something else began to fill the air, the sound of Moldavian war horns. It started softly, one horn, then another, echoing from different directions. In the fog, it sounded like the valley itself was alive. The Ottomans slowed. Some shouted orders. Others searched the mist for movement. But the fog gave them nothing. Then Stephen struck. A sudden roar of arrows burst from the heights. Hundreds at first, then thousands. The fog made it impossible for the Ottomans to see where the shots were coming from. But the arrows cut through the white haze and hit their ranks with brutal accuracy. Soldiers raised shields, stumbled, shouted, and tried to form proper lines, but they didn't even know which direction the attack was coming from. Before they could regroup, Moldavian cannons fired, small mobile guns hidden behind ridges. Their thunder echoed through the valley, amplified by the fog. Shot after shot hammered the Ottoman columns, breaking their formations and forcing them into confusion. As the Ottomans tried to reorganize, Stephen delivered his next blow. Light cavalry units charged out of the fog from unexpected angles. Striking the Ottoman flanks with speed and precision, they fired arrows, slashed with sabers, then vanished back into the mist before the Ottomans could counterattack. Some units hit from the left, others from the right, and sometimes from both at once. The Empire's disciplined infantry suddenly found themselves fighting shadows. In the valley, panic spread. Officers shouted conflicting orders because no one could see the full battlefield. Units moved forward when they should have held their ground. Others retreated into their own allies. The fog twisted sound, making it impossible to tell where commands were coming from. Stephen watched from a concealed ridge. He waited. He needed the Ottomans to be fully disoriented before unleashing the final blow. When the moment came, he signaled his trumpeters. A deep, rolling blast filled the valley. A Moldavian called a charge. From behind the fog, Moldavia's main battalion surged forward, descending the ridges in a coordinated assault. This was the strike Stephen had been saving. Infantry and elite guards sweeping down like an avalanche, hitting an enemy already blinded, scattered, and exhausted. The valley erupted into chaos. Ottoman soldiers, still struggling to see, suddenly found Moldavian infantry crashing into them from the front, while cavalry hammered them from the sides. Shields splintered, horses slipped on frozen mud, drums and trumpets drowned beneath the sounds of men shouting, steel clashing, and the hiss of arrows raining from above. Some Ottoman units tried to fall back across the frozen river, but the ice had weakened under days of marching. Moldavian archers targeted the crossings. Arrow after arrow struck the ice, and men began falling through into the freezing water. Those who reached the far bank discovered new enemies awaiting them. Moldavian riders had circled behind the valley and now blocked any hope of retreat. The once massive Ottoman army found itself trapped, pressed between riverbanks, fog-covered slopes, and relentless attacks from all sides. Stephen rode into the battlefield only when the enemy was fully broken. His presence ignited a final wave of Moldavian courage. Soldiers pushed forward, pressing the Ottomans deeper into disorder. The empire's battle standards dropped one by one, disappearing into the snow. By midday, the fog began to lift. What it revealed was a valley torn by one of the most devastating defeats the Ottoman Empire had ever suffered. Thousands of soldiers lay scattered across the frozen ground. Others fled into the woods, only to be hunted down by Moldavian scouts familiar with every trail. For Stephen's men, the victory was overwhelming. For the Ottomans, the loss was unthinkable. And for Europe, the news that a small principality had routed an empire would echo far beyond that frozen valley. But for now, in the aftermath of the battle, the only sound was the wind moving across the snow, carrying with it the memory of a morning when Moldavia refused to die. When the last echoes of battle faded across the valley, the fog finally lifted. What emerged beneath it did not look like the remains of a clash between two sides. It looked like the remains of a disaster. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers were scattered across the frozen ground, some lying where the arrows had struck them, others collapsed near the shattered ice where the river had swallowed entire formations. The once mighty columns that had marched confidently into Moldavia were now gone, replaced by scattered survivors struggling to understand how their overwhelming numbers had turned into a devastating defeat. Stephen did not celebrate, not yet. Victory on the battlefield was one thing. What came after was another. He rode slowly through the valley, not as a conqueror admiring trophies, but as a commander making sure the danger was truly over. His horse moved carefully across the churned snow, while his officers reported which parts of the Ottoman force had been destroyed, which had fled, and which might still regroup somewhere in the forest to the south. The Moldavians pursued the retreating Ottoman soldiers for miles, but Stephen ordered his men not to chase too far. He understood the risks. A triumphant army could quickly turn reckless, and he refused to lose men to carelessness. Instead, he sent small, fast units, scouts who knew the land, to monitor the escape routes. Their reports confirmed what he had hoped. The Ottoman army was no longer an army. It was a mass of scattered groups running in different directions, leaderless and frozen, many without weapons, some without boots, all desperate to reach safety. Word spread quickly across the countryside. Farmers who had hidden in the woods emerged. Villagers who had fled in fear came back to their homes, moving quietly among the trees as if they weren't sure whether to believe the news. Then they saw Moldavian soldiers returning victorious, carrying captured banners and prisoners. Relief washed over them, relief mixed with disbelief. Against all logic, against all predictions, against the terrifying reputation of the empire, Moldavia had won. Stephen gathered his council that same evening. The men were exhausted, many wounded, but their faces carried something more powerful than fatigue: pride. They had stood against an army that should have crushed them, and yet they were still standing. But Stephen's mind was already on what came next. He knew that defeating an Ottoman force once did not guarantee safety. The empire was vast, disciplined, and relentless. A single setback, no matter how humiliating, would not stop it from trying again. Stephen needed Europe to understand this. He needed allies to finally realize that Moldavia was not a distant buffer, but a shield between them and the advancing empire. So he sent messengers riding through the night, carrying news of the victory to the courts of Hungary, Poland, and beyond. Their letters described what had happened at Vaslui, not as a boast, but as a warning. If Moldavia had fallen, the Ottomans would already be standing at the gates of Central Europe. The victory had not just saved one principality, it had bought time for everyone. Across Europe, reactions were immediate. Kings and nobles who had ignored Stephen's earlier pleas now praised him openly. Chronicles later wrote that the bells of Krakow rang for days. In Rome, the Pope called Stephen a champion of Christendom. In Transylvania and Poland, travelers carried word of the battle, speaking of it with a sense of awe, as if they were recounting a miracle. But while Europe celebrated, Stephen remained cautious. He reinforced fortresses, he repaired damaged roads, he ensured his soldiers were fed, armed, and sheltered. He knew the Ottomans would recover, regroup, and return with anger fueled by humiliation. The Battle of Vaslui was a victory, but it was not the end of the struggle. As night fell over the valley, Moldavian soldiers lit torches along the ridges. The flames flickered across the snow, illuminating the land where they had stood together against overwhelming odds. Some men prayed, others sat quietly, thinking of those who had fallen. A few simply stared at the frozen sky, trying to understand how they had become part of a moment that history would remember. Stephen looked over the valley one last time before returning to camp. It was still, cold and silent. Yet in that silence there was something powerful, something earned, something that felt like the breath of a nation refusing to be erased. Moldavia had survived, and because it survived, Europe had a chance to breathe again.